Yep.
So this is very brief, so I'm hoping to cover all these topics. So what is gambling? Why is it addictive? What are the determinants? Why is it an important issue in public health? And how has the issue intensified in the Rona times? Okay, so what is gambling? I think the best definition I've seen is from magician John Scarn, who says that gambling is risking something one owns in the pursuit of something better. I use this picture from The Simpsons because I love The Simpsons. Okay. So how does gambling manifest? Well, you've got your scratch cards, which I like to buy and put in people's birthday cards. You've got betting on sports. You've got the fob teas, which Donald Trump actually was the first person to refer to these as the crack cocaine of gambling. Interesting fact there. Okay. So this is Isaiah Berlin. And for me, gambling is an immensely political issue and epitomizes Isaiah Berlin's positive versus negative concept of liberty. In a liberal, democratic, free market society, should citizens have the right to spend their money on gambling if they wish, or should a paternalistic nanny state government save them from themselves? So Isaiah Berlin's 1958 lecture on the two concepts of liberty is perhaps the most rigorous clarification of the notion of what freedom means within political discourse. He divides freedom into two concepts, positive and negative. Simply speaking, positive liberty is freedom to, and negative is freedom from. In the words of A.C. Grayling, for Berlin, positive liberty is the freedom to seek and realize certain goals, whilst negative is freedom from external compulsion. The two contrasting liberties effectively translate into the authoritarianism versus libertarianism dichotomy that has been at the epicenter of political philosophy ever since Plato and Aristotle. Where Plato argued for philosopher kings to control and rule man's natural passions, Aristotle argued that man was naturally sensible and rational and required no such governance. So I feel like these stats here really illustrate how it's viewed in society. So 7 in 10 people believe that gambling is dangerous for family life, but 67% of people think that everyone should have the right to gamble when they want. So I think these stats really highlight that ambiguity further. So gambling is addictive. Why is it addictive? Well, it essentially hijacks the reward part of the brain, which I'll go into a little bit more in a minute. So for Freud, the mania of gambling is a repetition of the compulsion to masturbate. And Dostoevsky likens gambling to an emotional roller coaster of despair and elation, predicated on whether the gambler is winning or losing. So Robert Sapolsky, he studied the psychology of why gambling is so compelling, and he did an experiment with monkeys. So they're in their lab, they're pulling levers in exchange for a piece of fruit. When certainty was removed and the monkeys only received a piece of fruit about 50% of the time, their dopamine levels increased like crazy, illustrating that when the element of uncertainty is introduced, the anticipation is the harbinger of joy, and dopamine production increases exponentially. So he calls this the pleasure of maybe. So what are the determinants? If you're male, of low income, unmarried, depressed, suffering from a personality disorder, a smoker, or addicted to drugs. But obviously, another huge determinant is culture. So if you live in a society where gambling is celebrated, ritualistic, or even just permissible, obviously one has a lot more opportunities to gamble. So there are 340,000 adult gambling addicts in the UK right now, with a further 2 million people identified as being at risk. And these stats really illustrate the ramifications for these people. So 45% of them had racked up debts of more than £5,000, were bankrupt or going through a debt repayment scheme. More than a quarter said they'd lost a relationship because of their gambling. 12% had lost a job. Research indicates that there are between 250 and 650 gambling-related suicides every year in the UK, but also the additional factor of the spouses of gambling addicts are 3 times more likely to commit suicide than the general population. So in the Rona times, people are working from home with constant internet access, people are drinking and taking drugs more, and they're isolated, so they're all contributing factors that create a perfect storm of increased online gambling, and also calls to gambling helplines have surged. So we talk about the R rate a lot. in the context of the coronavirus, and I just thought it was a good metaphor to use here to show that for every one person who's a gambling addict, 6 of their nearest and dearest are negatively affected by their gambling. I really liked this quote. So, frequent depiction of online gambling as a glamorous social activity is not just misleading but nauseating. In contrast to boozing, which can legitimately be associated with having fun with friends and socializing, gambling is a lonely pursuit. Put it this way, no one could fail to distinguish between the atmosphere in a pub and a betting shop. The former is convivial, the latter evokes misery and even despair. So why is gambling so permissible in UK society? I'm probably not going to say this night. Cui bono, to whose benefit? This is Denise Coates. She earns more money than Messi, Ronaldo, and Neymar put together, and she paid £573 million in tax last year. And 60% of profits derive from 5% of customers. Quis custodiet ipsos custodes. The gambling industry is largely trusted to self-regulate, which the Financial Times describes as hopelessly naive. You know, this stat illustrates that gambling companies have absolutely no incentive to help their customers. So I'm thinking for my dissertation, I haven't got my subject fully formed as of yet, to be honest. But I want to ask the question, what is the best way to curtail gambling whilst maintaining individual liberty in a democratic free market society? Or something along the lines of, from a public health perspective, what message about gambling should be conveyed to wider society? Okay, so I'd like to leave you with this quote that my friend told me his grandfather used to say to him: the quickest way to the poorhouse is fast women and slow horses. So stay away from gambling. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Pauline. Thank you. Very entertaining presentation. So I'm sure you will have some questions when we come to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next presenter is, let me put the slides first. So I lost my chair. So it's Amy. Our next presenter is Amy Beddows. She's a PhD student, and her topic is the medicalisation of trauma in women. Amy, I don't know if you are ready.
I am, yes. So,
okay, thank you.
All right, I'm just going to set myself a little timer so I hopefully don't run over. Okay, so hopefully everyone can hear me. Hi, I'm Amy Beddows. I'm a PhD student with QASU, which is the Child and Women Abuse Studies Unit at London Metropolitan. And yes, my presentation today is on the medicalisation of trauma in women. I just want to talk briefly about what today will involve. So my overall PhD research is into victim blame. So the presentation will include indirect references to sexual violence and abuse. I'm not going to talk about that in any graphic detail, but I just wanted to give a very little content warning. I'm going to focus on one of the key findings of my PhD so far, which is the medicalisation of trauma. I'm currently at the data analysis stage, so I'm still getting my head around everything that I found. But I'm going to touch on the different forms that medicalisation takes, the impacts it has, and where possible, I'm going to use the words of the women who took part in my research to contextualise it within their experience. And just as a bit of context of myself, as well as being a PhD student, I'm a trauma therapist. So I'm coming at this from, I guess, 2 angles. So my research is really trying to figure out how is victim blame communicated to and experienced by victim survivors. And I'm sure most people will have heard of victim blame. It's a process that's most widely known in the context of sexual violence, and it's ultimately blaming people for what they've experienced, or at least making them responsible. But we don't know very much about how it's communicated or experienced. So I ran 9 focus groups in total with women who'd experienced abuse, and I did this through rape crisis centres throughout England and Wales, and I asked them to talk about their experiences of interacting with agencies and with professionals. Now, interestingly, there were only 5 instances of direct blame mentioned as being experienced from agencies. So ultimately, you know, the initial finding could be that victim blame is no longer an issue, and somehow as a society we've solved it, and that's brilliant. What my research found, though, unfortunately, is that negative experiences are much wider than blame. So some of the examples women gave of interacting with professionals was not feeling heard, not feeling listened to, feeling disrespected, humiliated, punished, being given limited options, and just feeling that they weren't a priority for services. They also felt that they were blamed for things other than their experience of sexual violence, and this is termed responsibilization. So women felt that agencies and professionals blamed them for how they were coping with their abuse, how they were raising their children, how they were engaging with agencies, pretty much any aspect of their life. And part of this was through medicalisation, which I'll focus on talking about today. And there were overall two forms of medicalisation. The women felt that their experiences of sexual violence was medicalised is this concept that we often use in healthcare of trauma, but also they felt they were medicalised just by the fact that they were women. So a brief kind of overview definition of what medicalisation is. It's the process of defining and treating human experiences as medical symptoms, diagnoses, and problems to be fixed. It's also widely referenced as the biomedical model of understanding, and many theorists have talked about it as being a way of understanding people. However, we have to take this idea of people with a grain of salt, because in line with traditional positivist approaches to science, it sees people as being white middle-class men. So white middle-class men are seen as the norm, and women or people from Black and minority ethnic communities or people with disabilities are very much seen as the other to this male norm. I'm sure many of you will have heard of Caroline Criado Perez's book, Invisible Women. She talks about this issue at length and why it's such a problem. So the relevance of medicalisation to my research: GPs were the most mentioned professional with whom women interacted following abuse, and counsellors or therapists were the fourth most mentioned. A few of the other healthcare professionals that women interacted with included community mental health teams, psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, inpatient staff, paramedics, crisis teams, and social workers. And as you can see, a lot of those professionals are rooted within mental health, but not all of them. So this included physical health issues as well as mental health issues. The medical model was also apparent in non-healthcare services. So the women said that when they interacted with the Department of Work and Pensions, particularly in relation to trying to access support or financial benefits, or through their workplaces, so occupational health or HR, as well as the criminal justice system, many of these professionals and services really were influenced by a medical model understanding of trauma, and that was not helpful for them. So I'm going to talk quickly through some of the different forms of medicalisation that the women experienced. A lot of the times women felt they were met with a very general response, a kind of one-size-fits-all. As this quote from one of the women says, you know, she went to see her GP about abuse and she felt she was treated in the same way that anyone else would be, and the same way as if she'd gone for a broken leg or a sore throat. The women felt that the approach was quite reductive. It fragmented them into labels, into symptoms and problems, and saw them as patients rather than whole people. And this is just an example of the many different diagnoses that women had been given when they'd reached out for help following sexual abuse. So depression, anxiety, self-harm, eating disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar, borderline personality disorder, and dissociative identity disorder. And that's a huge mouthful of disorders. The diagnoses that are perhaps most suited in theory to sexual violence and sexual abuse is post-traumatic stress disorder, or a newer diagnosis is starting to be appreciated, which is complex PTSD. But even this didn't suit the women. So as W3 sort of her quote shows, she managed to get a diagnosis of PTSD, but people didn't believe it. They're like, well, you've not been to war, you've not seen death and destruction, why would you have it? And W5 said that even though she felt, you know, she matched every element of the PTSD diagnosis because of her experiences, it was never going to fit. She was never going to be given it because it's more likely to be given to men than to women. And it's more likely to be understood in the context of war or physical disasters or trauma rather than sexual violence. So even for the women who were able to obtain a PTSD diagnosis, it didn't account for their experience of sexual abuse. So the women's experiences, it was something that was done to them by another person, so a very interpersonal, relational, social issue that affected their whole life course. So some of the women who spoke with me were talking about events that happened 40, 50, 60 years previously, and it affected the meaning and the understanding they had of the world, of themselves and of others. So essentially, sexual abuse touched every aspect of their life. The way medical model understands it is it sees it as something that's wrong and needs fixing, and also something that's very localized. So we often talk about how trauma affects our memory or our limbic system or our fight or flight response. It's also seen medically as something that's very time limited. So the NICE clinical guidelines puts a number on the number of therapy sessions that's required to fix trauma. But also a lot of healthcare services are 9 to 5. So this idea that trauma doesn't really operate out of hours at weekends or evenings or holidays. For the women who were trying to access support, they felt that medical model meant they were only given very limited options, either medication or very limited types of therapy. And if they didn't want these options, or if they tried them and felt these options didn't work, the blame was turned back on them. They were seen as being non-compliant or not ready to help themselves. So they were blamed rather than medical model being seen as not fit for purpose. I'm referencing this book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, for two reasons. Personally, I think I really like this quote. He sums up the failings of the medical model, that you can't treat a war or abuse or molestation because what has happened cannot be undone. So the medical model is not fit for this. The other reason I mention it is a lot of the women that I met with spoke about this book specifically and said when they'd read it, it really helped them understand trauma and it was incredibly healing. So it shows that there is some good understandings of sexual violence out there, which is important to hold on to. The medical model and medicalisation, it's not holistic, it silos physical health from mental health, and it doesn't appreciate the way these two are linked or the way that they are also the results of trauma. So this particularly harrowing quote, I think, from W13 shows how the medical model and the healthcare system just wasn't helping her, it was making things worse. And for a lot of the women, it meant that they had to form some kind of piecemeal map of support. So one woman described it as a patchwork quilt, where bits and pieces of different needs were being met by different agencies, different professionals, different services, and women had to go from pillar to post to access all the support they needed, or they felt they're on a merry-go-round. One woman said that you get on, you get treatment, you feel a bit better, you get off, you get worse, and you have to get back on again. So it's this kind of revolving door, constant process. Not surprisingly, the medical model brings a lot of stigma. So as I mentioned, women would end up with a lot of diagnoses, and some of these are seen as particularly chronic and untreatable. So borderline personality disorder in particular is a diagnosis that's given to women. And even though we understand it often stems from trauma, it often blocks access to trauma therapy because it's seen as untreatable. And even with diagnoses that are recognised as more treatable, they come with an element of stigma. So W34 was given a diagnosis of depression, but she said that every time she went to services or professionals, she felt as if, oh, you're one of them. And everything she complained about or asked for help for was just put down to her depression. There's also an aspect of catch-22 in this. So the medical model really traps women within what one woman called medicalised circles. She felt that she bounced between her GP, a community mental health team, a crisis team, back to the community team, back to the GP, and that none of these services were able to help her, and she just ended up stuck in this constant circle. Some women ended up being blamed for becoming dependent on medication, which a GP or a psychiatrist had prescribed them. They were then referred to addiction services, which led to a whole new cycle of stigma, diagnosis, blame, and dependency. And as W33's quote shows, you're in this catch-22 where if you're not believed or you're not served by the system and you speak out, then you're kind of dubbed and dismissed as crazy. Susan Bryson writes about these different paradoxes that victim survivors face of being crazy but not too crazy. So you have to be crazy enough to warrant treatment, but you can't be too crazy because you have to be able to engage with it and follow procedure. So these are kind of impossible situations that the women found themselves in. There's also gatekeeping. Often it's GPs who decide who can access what, and these decisions are usually based on cost or locality or waiting lists more than individual needs. Women were often referred to in-house NHS services more than specialist external services such as rape crisis, even though we know these services exist and that they're set up to specifically work with sexual violence and survivors. And again, this thorny issue of PTSD, this diagnosis is often needed to access specialist therapy, but as we've said, it's very difficult to get hold of it. Now, moving on to gender, as we've said, there's been some gender issues already within this model, that women are more likely to receive certain untreatable diagnoses than men, but also the women felt they were punished if, in their interactions with agencies, they violated gender norms. So a couple of women said that if they got angry when talking about their abuse, they were either sedated or they were told to leave. So they didn't feel they could express non-typically female behaviours or emotions. They also, quite a few of the women really felt that the poor treatment they received was more linked to the fact they were women than to their status as victim survivors. And partly this was because women felt that they were treated exactly the same way, regardless of if they were seeking help for abuse or for non-abuse related issues. So a lot of them talked about gynecological symptoms being dismissed, pain being dismissed, and being told that it's not real, it's in your head, you're imagining it. And these aren't revolutionary findings. This fits with what we've known for an awfully long time. As Schur mentioned in his book from the 1980s, we know that the medical profession often mirrors some of the gender inequality and power imbalances between men and women that exists in larger society. And I really like this more recent quote from Sadie Doyle, as they sum up, men are allowed to have problems, whereas women are made into problems. So unsurprisingly, being medicalised comes with a lot of different impacts. The women said that it really affected their self-esteem. They felt devalued and stigmatised, and they felt that their problems weren't legitimate, that they were just hysterical or attention-seeking. A lot of their experiences with healthcare professionals mirrored their experiences of abuse. Procedures were intrusive, they felt they were silenced or gaslit, and they felt subjected to conditional threats. If you don't take this medication, I'll say you're non-compliant. If you miss your first appointment, we'll discharge you from the waiting list. So it ended up re-traumatizing women in some cases. It ended up making them more isolated, so they withdrew from services because they weren't having their needs met, but it isolated them from themselves because they ended up questioning their reality. Am I just crazy? Am I hysterical? Did it really happen? Their health issues weren't addressed and ended up getting worse. So for some women, 2 women who took part in the study said that they became infertile as a result of their gynecological issues being ignored and dismissed. And as we've already mentioned, women felt trapped in these medicalisation dependency cycles. And this ends up maintaining the medical model, but also maintaining our general misunderstandings of sexual violence and abuse. So it's a self-fulfilling system. I think these 2 quotes really sum up the experience of being medicalised. As W3 said, that's the medical model. If you deviate or find yourself on a path that doesn't adhere to it, you can forget getting help from the NHS. And W4, and I should mention I anonymised the women who took part in my study to protect their identities, which is why I'm using numbers here. For W4, she was pushed to the point of trying to kill herself because she felt so dismissed by healthcare services. And as she says, they just don't get it. And that's why I think, is this the best I've got? So the impacts are very real and very devastating. I'm conscious this has been quite a depressing presentation, but I think it's important for us to understand this as a way of talking about how healthcare services can change and even how we can reconstruct understandings of trauma in a way that actually suits victim survivors. So I guess the main takeaways are that victim blame, this concept that we kind of know and talked about, it's far wider than just blame, and medicalisation is a common part of that. But also medicalisation is not just apparent in healthcare services, it's drifted into other agencies and sectors and a wider understanding of sexual violence and trauma. In some cases, medicalisation can replicate the impacts of trauma, and it does seem that it's linked to gender more than abuse. Now, what I'd love to do is to do comparative research with male victim survivors and really talk to them about their experiences of healthcare and other services and how they feel their trauma is understood, to see how does the factor of gender play in. I've included references here if anyone's interested in learning more, or please, if anyone has any thoughts or questions about this. As I say, I'm in the data analysis stage, so I'm very open to discussing this finding and how it fits in. Please do get in touch, and I've popped my email up on there. I've tried to include a little hopeful photo of a lake in happier pre-COVID times, just as a little upbeat ending. But thank you very much for your time. I will finish there.
Many thanks, Amy. That's fantastic presentation and piece of research you're conducting here. We have time actually, but we're gonna go through the questions. I'm sure there are gonna be many questions for you as we have planned. And I am going to introduce, if that's okay, with Alya, Dr. Alya Khan and Professor John Gabriel. I don't know, we are a bit early, but I'm not sure if you are ready, both. Alya and John?
Yeah. Hello, Yolanda.
Okay.
We're both
so
here,
the
I think.
topic. Okay, good. So it's about the presentation is research in health education using oral history methods, themes and stories. I assume you are going to be perhaps sharing, yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's perfect.
That's right.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to the organisers for inviting us, and my name is Dr. Alya Khan, and I am Senior Lecturer in Health Ethics in the School of Social Professions.
And I'm John Gabriel, and I'm also in the School of Social Professions. And I just like to say it's really great to see so many familiar faces, familiar names on the list of participants, including some of our students from SH 5000. So I'm going to start by saying a little bit about the project. The project that we're going to talk about grew out of our mutual teaching interests, and Alya will tell you a little bit about the module in a moment. I should stress it's work in progress, and that we hope to conduct some more interviews and certainly to work on the analysis and the implications. So bear that in mind, but we'd really like to hear from you in terms of your comments or questions or suggestions. First of all, just a little bit about the wider policy and research context. I suppose the first major bit of evidence that informed our interest was the evidence on the awarding gap, which many of you will be aware. There's recent evidence suggests there's a 13% gap between the good degrees that are awarded to white students and those from Black, Asian and minority ethnic background. So the awarding gap was one bit of context. The other was that research that's been conducted on higher education, I think a review of 17,000 articles found very little pedagogic research on BAME students or involving BAME students. So we wanted to try to address those kinds of gaps and issues, problems. We wanted to do some research that focused on student experiences and life experiences, and also think about it in relationship to the curriculum. We used oral history methods, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But just to say, by way of kind of prefacing the presentation, there were a few issues and challenges we had to address, because not least because of lockdown and the need to conduct interviews remotely. So we started off with a group of around 20 volunteers from the student group pre-COVID, and then we ended up with 9 interviews. At the same time, conducting the interviews remotely gave us some insights into the lives of our students, childcare responsibilities, paid work commitments, as well as the physical space at home, all of which presented significant challenges for them as they were all undertaking, obviously, a full-time degree course. As many of them are actually here today, I think I've seen their names on the participant list. We did write to them, and we expected them to be here. We did write to them in advance of the presentation today, just to make sure that it was okay for us to talk about the research, but also just to make sure that they understood we would be anonymizing their names. And also, obviously, we won't be using sound recordings, which you would normally expect to do with oral history research. Again, in order to try to anonymize the students involved. We'll talk a little bit more about the project if you'd like to later, but I just want to move on to talk a little bit about oral history, which may be a research method that's unfamiliar to many of you. And the use of oral sources in history by oral, it's those based on the spoken word, predates actually the term oral history itself. Histories of great civilizations in China, Greece, Rome, the Americas, were all documented on the basis of the spoken word. But the term itself actually dates from the 1940s in the United States and in the late 1960s in the UK. And in the UK in particular, it became very quickly associated with the history, if you like, the histories of working class communities, of women, of Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups. There was a strong emphasis then on giving voice to marginal or excluded groups and communities. The intention then was to write alternative histories, not from the point of view of the great and the good, of kings and queens, of political leaders, of military leaders, using official sources, but through the lives and experiences of ordinary people. It's a qualitative method using an open-ended interview approach that leaves lots of room for listening, probing, digressions, and surprises. It's the stories and events and experiences as told by the interviewee, or as oral historians like to call the narrator. It's those stories that matter and the meanings that he or she gives to them. So in that kind of process, the relationship between the oral historian and the interviewee is of great interest in oral history debates, as are the ways in which narrators remember and recount their lives. So we felt that the oral history method was ideal for the project. It foregrounded student experiences and offered us the best chance of challenging our assumptions and understandings of learners and learner identities. I should just add as a footnote to oral history that it's becoming increasingly recognised as an important research method in health and social care, and I've included in the list of references at the end of the presentation some that might be of interest to you, either thinking about doing primary research using oral history or secondary research drawing on the primary research of others.
So I'm just going to talk now about the module that we focused on in the research. So the interviews that we did, the oral history interviews that we did, focused on students who had taken a second-year undergraduate health module called Ethics and Research in Professional Contexts. And I would like to just reiterate what John said, that we did get consent. We went through the ethical review process before we started the project, and we also see that informed consent is an ongoing process. So we did contact students who we knew would be here in the audience today, or might be, to see that they, were continuing to consent to the research being shared. I'd just like to thank you. It was a privilege to work with you on this. This research is about you, it's for you, it was done with you, and it's, it's aimed at informing policy and practice in education, but it's, it's for all of us. So the second year module that we focused on, students on it, it's a very large module. It has been extremely large in the past, up to 250 students. I think there are about 80 maybe this year. It's diverse cohorts, primarily women, however, mature students, students who fit the policy terminology of Black, Asian and minority ethnic. The syllabus on the module, we look at controversial, in the first part of the module, we look at controversial moral dilemmas in health and social care from a professional ethics perspective. In the second half of the module, we look at research issues, again, focusing on the ethical aspects of research. We start from cases, so we look at case studies involving ethical dilemmas within health and social care, so a range of issues from traditional questions about the rightness and wrongness of abortion to more contemporary questions right now about the conduct in service provision for the treatment of COVID-19. And we focus on creating spaces where we can have discussions across difference about our points of view about what might be right or wrong in any given case. So personal judgments of dilemmas that are discussed together in groups. And then we move to ethical theory and law and professional codes of conduct. So what we've done is we've tried to create a discursive learning environment across different views with regular group work, so weekly group work sessions that builds directly to the assessment. And we have traditional forms of assessment, written essays, but formative work as well with presentations and the group discussions. And we focused on trying to have, it's from our point of view, we've from the very start, and this module's been running a long time, we've created it using critical pedagogy ideas. So we focused on having an engaged teaching to engage learners. And I can talk a bit more about that later as well, when we look at how we've analysed some of the things that students said in response to the questions in the oral history interviews. But I should say it's radically student-centred. It foregrounds student views. We ask students, so we do provide case studies, these scenarios, but we also encourage and try to create spaces in the class for students to bring their own ideas, their own stories, their own testimonies, their own views right into the centre of the curriculum. So there are interactive mini lectures, group work, and they draw, the way that the module's been designed draws on conceptualization of a relational form of learner autonomy and critical pedagogy. And I'll say a bit more about what I mean by relational autonomy, I think on the next slide. So we did approach the interviews with theoretical interests that, as I say, have gone into informing the way that the curriculum was designed before we gathered the data from these interviews. So for a long time it was constructed in this way, and this was a really good opportunity to see whether what we were hoping for was what was happening from students' own point of view. So we were interested in the idea of the hidden curriculum in higher education. That focuses on, so that concept has a long history. It goes back as far as Dewey, even further back. But in recent times, there's been interest in applying this concept to exploring higher education contexts. So before it was mostly compulsory education, to look at curriculum design, how curriculum design and pedagogy impacts educational inequalities and life chances in terms of what might be happening that's kind of below the radar that affects people's experiences of their learning. So what's hidden and seen as normal under the radar, but that isn't well known. And that kind of linked into another concept that I've been quite interested in, which is the mythical norm, which is something from the work of Audre Lorde. The idea that, so Audre Lorde was writing in 1984, and she sort of highlighted at that time that what she was identifying as the mythical norm was the person who is white, thin, male, young, heterosexual, Christian, and financially secure. And she said, look, this norm is always on the edge of consciousness, seemingly neutral. It's everywhere like air. But in fact, it diminishes the space for those who don't fit this ideal, this norm. It's in fact oppressive and discriminatory. And we wondered whether this might be around with the conception that there might be a mythical norm around what it is to be a good student. And, you know, Lorde suggests, she gives an analytical tool with this conception that suggests that, you know, if we can do some work to make the norm visible, that this norm that's on the edge of consciousness, if we bring it into focus, then it will dissolve because it is just a myth, and its effects can be minimized or eradicated. And we connected this with ideas from Kimberly Crenshaw around intersectionality and how power can be understood as that we should look at multiple axes of power when we're analysing how people are experiencing their the conditions within which they find themselves, that these multiple axes of power can affect different people differently depending on where they're positioned and what their identities are. So, you know, gender, race, ethnicity, ability, sexuality, all those differences that we talk about in the module actually all the time. Other theoretical ideas that we were interested in: epistemic injustice, from the work of Fricker and others, that looks at how people might be not valued in their capacity as knowers, and that harms are done to them in that way, that their testimonies are not valued, or the interpretation of what they say is not valued enough to be participating in norm construction. And that connects with structural injustice that goes beyond the individual experiencing that kind of harm, of having their testimonies not valued, to ideas of how institutions might function in perhaps unknown ways, because they're invisible and seen as normal and neutral, to create systems to create conditions that hinder rather than support people's ability to progress and develop and learn. Another concept that we also, there are quite a lot of concepts here that we were thinking about, that we had in mind: relational autonomy and narrative ethics. Relational autonomy and narrative ethics are things that John and I have written about in the past, done some research before. So we talked about how you can challenge didactic individualistic student-centeredness, which is there in the policy documents quite a lot. We see it as something that can be challenged by looking more relationally at how you can support the development of learner autonomy and agency through narrative methods. And the oral history method, of course, leaves open the door to the development of new concepts. Now, this slide takes us to some of the findings. Now, as John says, you know, we've done the interviews and we've collected a lot of data, and we've been having a look at what we've got, but we're still in the analysis stage. But some of the things that we have found around group work and learner autonomy is that the things that students have been saying to us do fit quite a lot with our hopes around the design of the module supporting relational autonomy. So the module design assumes learner autonomy is primarily constitutively social relational, and recognises students as social and situated selves who develop a capacity for autonomy in relational contexts. And so here's a quote on language and group learning from Rita. This is an anonymised quote. She says about group learning, we prefer them, the group work sessions, because if we're struggling in class, we benefit from the interactions in the group. The English is totally different to what I learnt back home, and what you say as a typical Englishman is different. There are Africans and Caribbeans, and there are commonalities between us. Amongst colleagues, fellow students, we can explain in pidgin. Nigerians and Ghanaians would have an understanding, so if someone doesn't understand, we can explain in pidgin, and we can learn from each other that way. We share a common language compared to what lecturers speak. So this kind of challenges the idea of didactic top-down academic knowledge, being, you know, that we're pouring the knowledge into you. It suggests that what's happening is there is peer support and the development of ideas, exploring what is being delivered in the curriculum, and to clarify the theories and the models, address the laws and policies for yourselves, that students are facilitating their own reasoning through the group work, in the group work sessions. Here's another quote from Ivy. for me, sometimes it can be an eye-opener because you've got so many different cultures within the classroom. And what I would see to be normal to me is not normal to somebody else. And I learned so much in lessons, so much about different nationalities and their backgrounds and what their values and how they do things, how they have to do things because of culture and everything. Really, it was an eye-opener for me. And I really did enjoy ethics.
The interviews also illustrated a lot of critical thinking on the part of students in relationship to their own ethical selfhood, their sense of themselves as ethical beings, and also wider understandings of social injustice and social injustice. So I think as tutors on the module, we've seen our role to provide students with a kind of toolkit, a toolkit that inside's got ethical principles, ethical theories, questions, concepts that students can then be encouraged to apply not only in their classroom discussions and in their assignments, but also in their personal and professional lives. So we thought we'd give you a couple of examples. The first one from Rita. If you have a look at the quotation there, Rita talked about her role as a domiciliary care worker. And she said, contrary to previous training instructions, she was asked to visit people's homes during the pandemic without adequate PPE, including to clients with COVID. So she reflected on this situation by weighing up her duty of care to service users against the interest of her family, and her husband had diabetes, so there was a real risk associated with his health condition. From the perspective of the module, she posed and what Alya has described as the organisation of the module, an ethical dilemma. On the one hand, she was weighing up deontological principles, a duty of care, and on the other, utilitarian arguments taking account of the risk of harm and potential consequences for her family. And having weighed those up, she decided in the end not to attend the home of the COVID sufferer. And if you had a look through, you'll see how she describes that dilemma in her own words. Evidence also suggests that the module enabled students to think beyond their individual circumstances, particularly using the ideas that have been written about human rights and health, Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, to name two, who think about health as a human right, not just the right to access health, but actually the right to bodily health, alongside other human rights, to think, to reason, and the entitlement to justice. These are called capabilities according to these theorists, and they require and imply a radical redistribution of resources to make them happen. The flip side, though, of understanding rights and justice is an awareness of injustice. And Vanessa, to use her anonymized name, was a student who had survived some major health and domestic challenges. And this is what she says: I didn't know that if you're richer or have a better lifestyle, basically you have better options to health, a better education, you live longer. I just didn't see it like that, no. And the ethics, what we're doing now, being humble, having humility, treating people with fairness, all those acts, all the discrimination acts, and being able to have, what's that one where we can say our own, was it autonomy? I didn't know about those things until I came to the course.
So on this slide, here are some of the analysis that we've done so far. so looking at the different themes that are coming out of the stories from the oral history interviews. What we've seen is that using the tool of the mythical norm from Audre Lorde has helped us to do what she created this analytical tool for, make visible and be able to challenge the mythical norm of the successful, good student, that we're able to kind of make visible through the words of the students. And we have lots and lots of transcripts of things that people told us from those 9 interviews, making visible the intersectional nuances of students' identities and lived experiences, and being able to link those to a better understanding of what the barriers might be to success, to experiencing a sense of autonomy and agency as a learner. And we've also been making connections between, so thinking about the concept of epistemic injustice from Fricker and Dotson, ways in which the testimonial and hermeneutic harms that some students might experience, that their testimonies are not valued, their ability to participate in norm construction about what counts as good ways to arrange curriculums, how to best support becoming able to interpret for oneself one's own experience of those hermeneutic harms. So the oral histories can serve as a counterpoint to those kinds of harms. So they will get, one of the things I think John said at the beginning about oral history method is that the stories that are told in the voices of the people themselves who are experiencing whatever it is that you're investigating become part of the historical record, and they're valorized and foregrounded, so they can contribute to kind of minimizing these kinds of epistemic harms. So in our analysis, we're looking at how we can work towards explicitly valuing these non-hegemonic cultural knowledge. Also, this feeds into that concept of structural injustice that I mentioned earlier from the work of Elizabeth Anderson, that suggests that we can do practical things, very practical things in our curriculum design, and this is something that we're working on throughout the university actually with the Education for Social Justice framework, but that has always been at the heart of this particular module, to work to create spaces that where those that sort of dialogic discursive pedagogy is at the heart of everything we do. So when you're looking at decolonizing and making more and more room for knowledge construction from those who've been marginalized previously, that this is something that is not just about adding in extra readings, but it's something about how the curriculum itself is organized. So from what students were telling us, what works so well for them when it comes to their own learning in those group work situations, that can be connected to this idea of decolonizing as something that's broad and deep. And then we've also looked at rethinking student-centeredness, this idea of student-centeredness that has hitherto been seen as about removing external interference in somebody's ability to learn, as something that's relational, and focusing on collective empowerment via a specific form of discursive pedagogy that involves ongoing, purposeful, open and trustful dialogue.
Okay, in the last few seconds, let me just summarize some of the implications for practice that we've pulled out so far from the work that we've done. I think the first is to emphasize the importance of narrative methods, not just in terms of oral history research methods, but also in terms of our teaching. So using narrative approaches in our teaching, understanding the backgrounds, values, and motives of our students is important. Group work is integral to knowledge creation and assessment. So I think we've highlighted the importance of group work in terms of student learning. It's an important site for learning with confidence, and it should play an important role in our curriculum design and assessment. I think we pulled out some of the limitations of just thinking about the individual learner, and even categories like BAME. I think the focus on intersectionality reveals a more complex pattern of difference and shared meanings, and that really comes less from top-down policy initiatives from governments, but it's more rooted in how students make sense of their lives and their learning and how they position themselves rather than have those positions imposed on them. It's important then for learning environments to provide spaces for students to express and develop their own sense of selves collectively and individually. Just to reiterate the point that Alya made, decolonizing the curriculum is not just about replacing authors and texts, but it's about a learning process. It's not just about content, but it's about acquiring the skills of criticality and questioning. And I'll finish up if I've got time just to say that one final bit of feedback that didn't come from this project, that came from a student a few years ago who came up to me at around after the first term and said she didn't really understand the module to begin with. She didn't understand why she wasn't getting any answers, and that every time she wanted an answer, I gave her another question. And she said eventually the penny dropped, and it was up to her to develop her own answers based on reasoning, evidence-based argument. And she said, which was the icing on the cake for me, that was how she was going to approach service users. She was going to ply them with questions and give them the tools to answer the questions, but not give them the answers. So I just wanted to finish by thanking everybody for your attention. A special thanks to our students. And if any more of you would like to be interviewed, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Please, we would. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you, Alya. And also thank you, Amy and Polly. We are open up now for questions and discussions. You can raise your hand, or you can type your questions in the chat, and I'm happy to take. Okay. Any questions? A lot of thank you, and people engage in these projects. I had a question, if anyone is not coming forward. I have a question for Amy. Don't know if Amy, are you here?
I am, yes, fire away.
So I just wanted to ask, because you presented with a focus on a critical thinking around, in particular, the medicalisation of trauma, and of course you have presented based on a lot of interviews that you are running or you have conducted already. I just wanted to ask you, from those interviews, did you manage to find out which type of services will help those women, will serve them better? Because obviously we understand all the issues that they've gone through, and it was very good presentation to unpack all the issues of medicalisation. But did you manage to see what they will prefer as service users?
Yes, yeah, that was a big part of the discussions as well. Because I held the group discussions at rape crisis centres, I asked them how is this environment different, and actually that was something they mentioned, because rape crisis, they take it from a very they work with people from a feminist whole person perspective. That was something they said felt different. You know, rape crisis doesn't particularly deal with diagnoses or medication, and it was much more about helping the women to identify the different needs they had, but also giving them the space to just explore or talk about their experiences in any way they wanted to. So some other agencies did have a similar approach, but I think, well, not a similar approach. I think it was more often like an individual professional would ask, tell me what you want to tell me, or, you know, share what you want to share, or let's use your language. But that was the exception more than the rule outside of organizations like Rape Crisis, which are feminist and kind of whole person focused. So that was the main thing that came out of it.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. I have a question. I'm looking at the chat simultaneously, so if you hear me. Jolanda, I was thinking it will help Amy's work if she would include question about what they think should be done.
Yes, yeah, and that was a big part of it. So the what I presented today with the time was just, I'm going to write a chapter on medicalisation. Sure. My next chapter is on the positive experiences and what women felt would make a difference. So you're absolutely right. I think that's the important bit. What can we do about it?
Okay, thank you, Livingstone and Amy. Any other questions or comments? As I said, you can, Ian. I think, Ian, I'm going to make you a moderator, just in case. Ian, you can use your mic. Yeah.
Yeah, I've just turned it on. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can.
Okay,
Ian.
good. Thank you to all the presenters so far this morning. A particular question for Alya and John, if I may. I just wondered, it's a bit of a provocative question, I suppose, in terms of how radical do you think you might go in terms of teaching ethics in relation to things like education for social justice? I'm thinking particularly of the sort of, perhaps some of the inconsistencies between teaching a sort of an ethical or philosophical canon that's very much dominated by Western theory and by a male set of theorists as well. How radical do you think we might be in terms of teaching ethics, using things like discursive ethics and other approaches?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think that's a really good question. And I think that from my point of view, and I think this is something that should be discussed amongst colleagues and anyone who's teaching and students who are the learners, I think what I seem to be getting from the interviews was it's not so much about what's on the reading list. Okay, so long as there's enough there to give the opportunity to explore, and it's more about how you go about engaging, offering opportunities to engage with the material. So, you know, yeah, have all sorts of texts can be on the reading list. Yeah, and ours is pretty diverse actually, but it's about how the methods of engaging with it that are offered. That's the way to be as radical as possible. So to bring in all those different views about what's ethical, what counts as an ethical dilemma, and how we should go about reasoning to a decision about how to address it.
Thanks. Can I just ask a follow-up question to that, Yolanda, if I may? In terms of how might you capture that process? I mean, some of the quotes from the students, I think, were amazing in terms of the insight that they're beginning to develop and their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. And you know, I think that's really amazing. I just wonder how do we capture that in an assessment? And do you think, I suppose, do we think that you are capturing it currently? If not, how might we move assessment forward in a way that reflects that kind of learning, I suppose?
Yeah, great question. And I think there are different options that are available, and we can definitely explore that. Yeah. So the traditional essay is one thing. Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, I suppose I'm thinking
there are
more
other
in terms
ways.
of the as I say, some of the quotes, there's an awful lot of process going on there in terms of students working through things. I just wonder how do we begin to capture that process and the awareness that's developing as a result of that. And I wonder, and I don't think it's unique to ethics. So I'm not picking on that as a particular topic that's being taught in terms of how it's being assessed. But I think it's about how do we reflect within the assessments the student's individual journey, I suppose, to use a horrible phrase that's often misused in terms of reality TV shows and the like, but that kind of burgeoning awareness.
Yeah, can I just chip in here? Thank you, Ian. I think that's a very important question, and it's one that we need to explore. And I don't think that the module, there's still more work to be done in response to that issue on the module. I would say that the current assignment, an ethics essay, encourages students to develop their own argument in response to a case study. So we would expect them to, and the students in the audience, they back this up, to expect them to kind of think about the issues in relationship to their own values, their own backgrounds, and then negotiate those with professional codes of conduct and relate them to those ethical theories. So to answer the first question at the same time, your first question, I think that the knowledges and the experiences that students bring to the module are in a way a form of appropriating some of those Western philosophical canons and turning them into something that's more meaningful for our group of students.
Yeah, so it's capturing the critical thinking. Yeah.
Thanks both.
Thank you both. I think I have a question from Oluwakemi. It's asking about the expression cui bono. This is for Polly. Polly?
Oh, hi. Sorry. Cui bono is Latin for who benefits. I was just trying to make the point that, right now schools aren't open, and yet horse racing, football, all other sports is still going on. Why is that? The woman in the picture is Denise Coates. She's the CEO of Bet365. She's worth like $7.5 billion. Thank you.
Thank you, Polly. I think there was a question from Livingstone. You have your hands up. Just bear with me. Can you speak, Livingstone, with your mic? Livingstone, try your mic on, please.
Yes, thank you. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Yolanda. And thank you to the presenters of the two sessions. Thank you. The studies are quite interesting and informative. Yeah, I just wanted to, first on Polly's work, I think since I understand, Polly, you are doing this work, you want it to be part of your dissertation. So I was thinking with regards to addiction from gambling, I think maybe one thing you may want to explore is gambling just as another product in a similar way like smoking. So much that maybe something that has to be considered more is if we take gambling in a similar way as a product like like smoking, tobacco and smoking. You know, we ended up with the anti-smoking legislation, which is quite the most radical way of intervening into issues that relate to what happens within society. So I was thinking, if you say, because gambling, yes, it causes addiction, which is a mental health disorder. Therefore, we can take in the same way we looked at smoking and looking at gambling, so much that whoever provides that that product, you know, they have to we have to take measures into consideration that are related to health in a way that we can safeguard health. Yes, because like you emphasize the point that in a free democratic society, people are free to choose what they want to buy, what they want to eat, what they want to have, the kind of behavior they want to have. But we can take a health right approach to kind of like regulate gambling in a way that providers have to be governed by some kind of legislation that can safeguard participants or service users or consumers, putting it that way, which can safeguard mostly their health. And then I want to jump on to Amy's work. I put on the chart that victim blaming, yes, you're looking at medicalization of trauma, but I think at the same time, you are looking at some things that are interesting. I don't know how that may be governed by the boundaries of your work. But yes, victim blaming is a form of abuse. And you may not get much of it if it's only from participants' point of view, the victims themselves. In any case, you may explore maybe how they felt like the quote you had there, somebody who actually thought of suicide as the last thing. Often people, they get to think that way because they don't find a way out. And whatever they have, nobody seems to listen. And they find themselves in a situation where, you know, they have a different story from what everybody else around them thinks or believes. So they may go to a GP, and the GP may, you know, like you were saying, that they find in the end as being victims who are being blamed of their situation, which they should be getting help. But one thing that might happen there is, number one, the people who are supposed to help, they themselves don't have a way they can help. So somehow they may end up kind of like dismissing it. So the victim then realize the situation is not being considered as they wish somebody would take an action. That's why I was suggesting, can you find out from them what they think should be done? But having said that, it would help a lot if there was a way, maybe this is outside the boundary of your work, to talk to the people who are expected to be providers of solutions, like GPs. Because one thing that may happen there as well is where somebody can kind of like dismiss it, or they themselves are part of committing victim blaming, because that's the way they see things. So a GP may think, oh, this lady, she's simply complaining of things because they themselves, that's how they treat women, or that's how they treat their own partners. You see, where they are already programmed to think, you know, women are a problem that way. So finding these, if there would be a way of finding them, would I'm sure would bring better solutions, or better ways of moving towards finding solutions. Because I think, like you found out, victim blaming is very wide in many different societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Livingstone. Amy, would you like to comment on this?
Yes, thank you, Livingston. Your comments, absolutely, I agree with everything you said, and I think because I focused on such a small part of what I've been looking at today, but one thing, being part of being a therapist, I feel like I'm part of the system as well. So one thing I wanted to be clear on in anything that comes from my research is it's exactly as you said. It's not about blaming the people who may be victim blaming. It's recognizing that they are part of a system which just doesn't allow for the kind of sensitive and understanding response to victim survivors. And I work in services where we have awful waiting lists, and it's not our fault. It's not an individual, but I know that sends a really negative message to people who are waiting, because it makes them feel like they're not cared about. So one of the things I'm hoping to do is write up some kind of best practice from exactly as you said, what the women said about what they think should work. But it's also, I would love to go on and actually do research, do focus groups with professionals as well, because I know it isn't that people don't like women or don't like victim survivors. I'm sure it's because GPs have 5 to 7 minutes for an appointment, and what can you do in that time, or they're limited by what they can refer to, and same with all staff. So no, you make really good points, and I think when I started this topic I hadn't realized it'd be quite as expansive as it is. So I would love to continue within research, but no, absolutely, thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Thank you both. I'm mindful of time, but I would like to ask everyone speaking here if they can keep your answers short, if possible. So that Dublin Hamilton is saying, what do you mean by decolonizing? My question is for Dr. John.
Yes, okay. Thank you for the question. I think decolonizing, if you take it in, first of all, in a political context, then it's about the kind of undoing of the systems of political annexation and control of overseas territories that characterizes colonialism and the building of empires. So decolonizing is the kind of process of resisting, rejecting, or moving beyond that system of domination. With regard to the curriculum, it's talking about, and I think Ian's question was hinting at this, the idea that knowledge is dominated by Western European canons and paradigms. And the colonizing the curriculum initiative is about looking at ways in which we can develop alternative paradigms that aren't rooted in Western knowledge and epistemologies. I think our point really from the slides was that whilst that's important, what we're most concerned about is thinking about decolonizing the curriculum as a process and bringing student experiences to the fore.
Okay, thank you, John. I have a question from Olive McEwen. She says, any thoughts regarding the role confusion, the module and learning versus the research project, researchers and students, from students or staff perspective in understanding the research? Did you inquire about this from the students?
Yes, I can answer that. I think if that's about our project, yes, the research ethics approval process is very supportive to make sure that all these kinds of issues are explored before you're given the go-ahead to conduct such research. And we did think about this quite a lot. That the open-ended style of oral history interviewing is designed to provide an opportunity for participants to review and reflect on their lives, what matters and what's meaningful, what choices they've made and why, and their experiences in higher education and on the module. But we did look at, the way we're collecting our data. We designed it then, therefore, to give participants as much control as possible over how they participate. No pressure is put on anyone. You can stop the process at any time or leave the process at any time. But we did, talk explicitly as well about the fact that, we're asking about experiences of learning on modules, but, the purpose of collecting the data is to think about improving, positive change in pedagogy in practice and policy, and that, here's an opportunity to contribute to that by participating. So yes, it was made explicit.
Okay.
Yeah, but you can't always guarantee that that's not going to, that somebody might, change their minds about participating, and that's okay as well.
Okay, thank you, Alya and John and Amy and Polly. I'm reading through the chat and saying I'm reading a lot of thanks to your presentations. I can see Polly thanking Livingstone for your feedback on my fledgling dissertation ideas. You're the best. Okay, so I think we can wrap up this session that actually took us longer, but I really enjoyed it. I mean, we took some time extra as we are going for a large break now. We will be back at 2 p.m. We still have a lot of things to cover, so please join us in the afternoon sessions that we will be starting, as I said, at 2. Thank you so much. Thank you for all the presenters, and I hope we will be back at 2 p.m. at this same site. Thank you.